Ron Howard was standing 3 feet from the control room monitors when the child actor on stage 4 stopped mid-line, looked directly into the live camera, and whispered something that made the studio audience fall completely silent. Wait, because what Ron does in the next 11 seconds, with 40 million households watching, will decide whether this night ends as television history or as a story nobody at the network ever wants to tell. The boy's name was Danny Weaver, 12 years old, brown hair that the makeup department always had to flatten down because it curled under the lights. He'd been on the show for 3 seasons, and in all that time, Ron had never once seen him forget a line. Not once. The kid was a machine in the best possible way. He hit his marks, he listened to direction, and he made the adults around him look good without ever seeming to try. But tonight, something was different. Ron had noticed it during the table read that afternoon, a slight hesitation in Danny's voice that wasn't in the script. He'd noticed it again during blocking, when Danny asked to run a scene a second time, even though he'd nailed it the first take. Small things, the kind of things you file away and forget. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because wherever you are, I want you to understand what it feels like to stand in a control room with 100 people waiting for you to make a call that could change a child's life. The studio was hot, not warm, hot. The kind of heat that builds when you've got a live audience of 300 people, 47 crew members, and enough stage lighting to illuminate a small airport. Ron could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck as he watched the monitors, his headset pressing against his temple like a second heartbeat. The talkback button was right there under his thumb. One push and his voice would go straight into Danny's earpiece. One push and he could say something, anything, to get the kid back on track. But he didn't push, not yet, because something in Danny's eyes told him this wasn't a forgotten line. This was something else entirely. Notice what happens next, because this is where most people in Ron's position would have already made the safe choice. The stage manager's voice crackled through his headset, cutting through the low hum of monitors and the distant murmur of the waiting audience. Ron, we've got dead air. What do we do? Ron didn't answer. He was watching Danny's face on the center monitor, watching the way the boy's chest was rising and falling just a little too fast, watching the way his hands were starting to shake at his sides. The studio audience had gone from confused to uncomfortable. You could feel it through the monitors, that collective shift when 300 people realize they're witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. The woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. The man beside her was leaning forward like he wanted to help but didn't know how. And the clock on the wall kept ticking. 5 seconds of dead air. 6, 7. Here's the first thing you need to hold on to. What did Danny whisper that night? I'll tell you exactly what he said, but I need you to understand what those words did to every single person in that control room first. The boy had said, so quietly that only the boom mic picked it up, I don't want to be here anymore. The words hit the control room like a physical force, like all the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out through the ventilation ducts. Ron watched Marcia Sloan, the showrunner, take a step backward from her position near the script supervisor. He watched Gerald Fontaine, the network executive, who'd flown in from New York specifically for this episode, grip the edge of the console so hard his knuckles went white, and he watched the technical director's hand hover over the emergency cut button, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell him what to do. But nobody said anything, because nobody knew what those words meant. Did Danny mean the scene, the show, the stage, or something darker that none of them wanted to name? Stop for a second and picture this control room from above, because who stood where will matter more than you think. Ron was at the center console, closest to the monitors. Gerald Fontaine was 2 steps behind him, and to the right, close enough to grab Ron's arm if he needed to. Marcia Sloan was near the door, almost like she was already planning her escape, and in the corner, barely visible in the dim light of the room, stood a woman with a clipboard pressed against her chest. Ron hadn't noticed her come in. He would notice her very soon. Listen closely now. We've been in dead air for 8 seconds, and the network's live broadcast window closes in exactly 12 minutes. Everything that happens from this point forward is happening against that clock. Ron's thumb found the talkback button. He pressed it halfway down, then stopped. If he spoke into Danny's ear right now, the kid might snap out of it. He might remember where he was and what he was supposed to be doing and deliver his next line like nothing had happened. The show would go on. The ratings would hold. Gerald Fontaine would stop looking like he was about to have a cardiac event. But Ron had been a child actor himself once. He knew what it felt like to have a voice in your ear telling you to perform, when every part of your body was screaming for you to stop. He knew what it cost to push through that feeling, night after night, take after take, until you couldn't remember who you were without the lights, and the cameras, and the constant pressure to be someone else. One child, one choice, one chance to get it right. The clock on the wall said 9 seconds of dead air now. 9 seconds of nothing but a 12-year-old boy standing frozen on a sitcom set while America watched, and the red second hand kept sweeping forward like it didn't care about any of them. Gerald Fontaine's voice cut through Ron's headset, sharp and urgent. "Howard, we need to move. Cut to commercial or get him talking. But we cannot sit here. We've got 11 minutes until the window closes." Ron didn't answer. He was still looking at Danny's face, still searching for something in the boy's expression that would tell him what to do. And then he saw it. Just for a moment, just a flicker. Danny's eyes moved from the camera to somewhere off stage left. Someone was standing there in the wings. Someone Danny was looking at like a lifeline or a threat. Remember this detail, because it changes everything that happens next. The person standing in the wings wasn't a crew member. It wasn't another actor waiting for their cue. It was Danny's mother, Linda Weaver, a woman Ron had spoken to maybe a dozen times over 3 seasons. She was always there on tape nights, always watching from the shadows with a clipboard and a stopwatch, always taking notes on Danny's performance like she was grading an exam. Ron had never thought much about it before. Stage parents were common in this business. Some were worse than others. But the look on Danny's face when he saw his mother standing there, that look told Ron something he should have noticed a long time ago. And that's the second thing I need you to hold on to. Why was Linda Weaver watching her son like that? And what had she been doing to him when the cameras weren't rolling? Ron released the talkback button without pressing it all the way down. Instead, he turned to his assistant director, a veteran named Eddie, who'd been doing live television since before Ron was born, and said 3 words that would become the most talked about production decision of the season: kill the feed. Eddie's face went pale. "Ron, we can't just kill the feed. Go to the backup segment, the cooking thing with Patterson. Do it now." Eddie hesitated for exactly 1 second, then nodded and started barking orders into his headset. The monitors flickered. The live camera light on stage 4 went dark, and just like that, 40 million households were watching a pre-taped segment about a fictional sitcom neighbor learning to make soufflé, while a 12-year-old boy stood frozen on a soundstage with tears streaming down his face. Wait, because killing the feed was only the first decision. What Ron does in the next 60 seconds will determine whether Danny Weaver ever acts again. The studio audience didn't know what was happening. They could see Danny standing there, could see the cameras pulling back, could see crew members starting to move toward the stage with the kind of careful urgency you use when you're not sure what you're walking into. A murmur went through the crowd. Confused, concerned, a little frightened. Someone coughed nervously. A child in the back asked their parent what was wrong with the boy on stage. Ron pulled off his headset and handed it to Eddie without looking at him. "I'm going out there," he said. Gerald Fontaine grabbed his arm. "Howard, you cannot walk onto that stage right now. The audience will see you. We'll have phones out. We'll have photos. We'll have—" Ron looked at Gerald's hand on his arm, then looked at Gerald's face. "Let go," he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made Gerald let go. 8 minutes until the broadcast window closed. 8 minutes to save a show or save a child. Before we go any further, you need to know one thing about Ron Howard. He started acting when he was 18 months old. By 10, he'd spent more hours on sound stages than most adults spend in offices over a lifetime. He knew what it cost to grow up under those lights, and he'd promised himself that if he ever had power on a set, he would never let a child pay that cost alone. Listen to what happened next, because this is the part that nobody outside that studio ever got to see. Ron Howard walked out of the control room, down the narrow hallway that led to stage 4, through the heavy soundproof door, and onto the set of a show he'd been directing for 3 years. The lights were still hot, humming with that electric buzz that anyone who's worked in television knows by heart. The cameras were still there, their dark lenses now pointed at empty space, and Danny Weaver was still standing in the same spot, his script pages scattered on the floor around him, his face wet with tears he wasn't even trying to hide. Ron walked toward him slowly, carefully stepping over cables and around light stands, and when he got close enough, he didn't say anything about the show or the schedule or the 40 million people who just watched this happen. He just knelt down so he was at Danny's eye level and said, "Hey, it's okay. We're not filming anymore. It's just you and me." Danny looked at him with eyes that seemed too old for a 12-year-old face. "Everyone saw," he whispered. "Everyone saw me mess up." Ron shook his head slowly. "You didn't mess up. You told the truth. That's not messing up." Behind them, Ron could hear the stage manager trying to figure out what to do with the audience. He could hear Gerald Fontaine's voice somewhere in the distance, loud and angry, probably on the phone with someone at the network. 6 minutes until the window. He could hear the hum of the lights and the soft whir of the air conditioning, and the shuffle of feet as crew members moved around the edges of the stage, unsure whether to stay or go. But he kept his focus on Danny, because right now, Danny was the only thing that mattered. Notice how quiet the stage got in that moment. 300 people in the audience, 47 crew members, and not a single one of them made a sound. They were all watching Ron kneel in front of this crying child, and they were all waiting to see what kind of man he really was. "Can I ask you something?" Ron said. Danny nodded, just barely. "When you said you don't want to be here anymore, did you mean the show, or did you mean something else?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke. Ron watched Danny's face carefully, looking for any sign that would tell him how worried he needed to be. And then Danny's eyes flickered toward the wings again, toward the spot where his mother was still standing with her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Hold this moment in your mind, because when we come back to it at the end, you won't see Ron the same way again. Danny didn't answer Ron's question directly. Instead, he said something that would echo in Ron's mind for years afterward. "She times everything. Every laugh, every pause, every time I blink wrong. She says if I'm not perfect, they'll replace me with someone who is perfect." 4 minutes until the broadcast window closed. 4 minutes, and Ron finally understood what he was actually dealing with. Ron felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd heard stories like this before. Every director in Hollywood had heard stories like this, but hearing it from a 12-year-old boy, with tears on his face, and 40 million people who just watched him break down, that was different. That made it real in a way that stories never could. Ron stood up slowly, his knees protesting after crouching on the hard stage floor. He turned to look at Linda Weaver, who was still standing in the wings, with an expression on her face that Ron couldn't quite read. Was it fear, anger, shame? Maybe all three swirling together behind her eyes. Ron walked toward her, aware that every eye in the building was following him, aware that whatever he said next would probably end up quoted in articles and whispered about in production meetings for years to come. 3 minutes. He stopped about 3 feet away from her and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Mrs. Weaver, I need you to leave the stage." Linda's face went hard, like concrete setting. "Excuse me, your son is having a difficult moment, and he needs some space. I'd like you to wait in the green room until we can figure out what happens next. He's my son. I have every right to—" "Right now," Ron said, and there was steel wrapped in velvet in his voice. "He needs to not see you. I'm sorry, but that's how it has to be." Linda Weaver looked at Ron for a long moment, her jaw working like she was chewing on words she wanted to spit at him. Then she looked at Danny, who was watching the whole exchange with an expression of terrified hope, and something in her face shifted like a mask slipping. Without another word, she turned and walked off the stage, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp, angry beats. Remember that promise Ron made to himself about protecting child actors? This is the moment it cost him something real. 2 minutes until the broadcast window closed. Gerald Fontaine appeared at the edge of the stage, his face the color of old newspaper. "Ron, we need to make a decision right now. We can either go back live with the backup cast and try to salvage the episode, or we lose the window entirely, and this becomes a conversation with legal in the morning." Ron didn't even turn around. "We're done for tonight, Gerald. Send the audience home. Tell the network whatever you need to tell them." He could practically hear Gerald's blood pressure rising. "Do you have any idea what this is going to cost us?" Ron finally turned to face him. "Less than it would cost that kid if we put him back on camera tonight." The studio audience was getting restless. Ron could hear them shifting in their seats, could hear the low murmur of conversation that meant they were starting to piece together what was happening. He walked to center stage, positioned himself where the cameras would have been pointing if they were still rolling, and did something he'd never done in his entire career. He addressed the audience directly during what was supposed to be a live taping. "Folks, I want to thank you for your patience tonight. As you can see, we've had an unexpected situation." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Our young star, Danny, is going through a tough moment, and I've made the decision to pause our taping so we can make sure he's okay. I know that's not what you came here to see tonight, and I appreciate your understanding more than I can say." He could see people nodding, could see the woman in the front row dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, could see something like respect spreading through the crowd. "We're going to ask you to head home for tonight. There's more of this show to come. I promise you that. But right now, taking care of our people comes first. It always has to come first." Look at what just happened in that room. 300 people who came to laugh at a sitcom suddenly became 300 witnesses to something more important than entertainment. Ron had given them permission to care about Danny as a person, not just as a performer, and they'd taken that permission and held it like something precious. Sometimes that's all people need, just permission. The next 2 hours were some of the most complicated of Ron's career. Gerald Fontaine was furious. There was no other word for it. He paced Ron's office like a caged animal, phone pressed to his ear, explaining to increasingly senior network executives why their Friday night lineup had just imploded. The phones were already ringing from entertainment reporters. Social media was filling up with speculation about what had happened to the kid from that sitcom. And somewhere in a green room down the hall, Linda Weaver was sitting alone with her clipboard, probably already planning how to spin this as someone else's fault. Ron handled it the only way he knew how, one problem at a time. First, he met with Danny in his office, just the two of them, and listened while the boy talked about the pressure he'd been under, the early call times, the late rehearsals, the constant criticism from his mother, who saw every stumble as failure. Danny had been carrying this weight for 3 years, and tonight it had finally become too heavy. Ron didn't offer advice, he just listened, because sometimes that's what people need most. Wait, because the story doesn't end with that conversation. What Ron did next is the part that actually mattered. Second, he had a conversation with Linda Weaver that he knew would probably end up in a lawyer's office. He told her that Danny wouldn't be returning to set until a licensed psychologist had evaluated him. He told her the production would hire an independent welfare coordinator, and he told her that if she had a problem with any of this, she was welcome to take it up with legal. Linda just stared at him with eyes that were somehow both furious and afraid. Third, Ron went back to the studio and salvaged the episode. Not the live version, that was gone, but they had backup material, pre-taped segments, and alternate takes, enough to fill the time slot. It wouldn't be great television, but it would be good enough. Notice how the energy shifted after that night. The crew started looking at Ron differently. The other actors started trusting him with things they'd never said out loud before. Something had changed in that building, in that show, in the way everyone understood what they were actually doing there together. When the patchwork episode finally aired 3 days later, spliced together from backup footage, and explained away with a vague technical difficulties message, the ratings weren't just decent, they were the highest the show had ever received. 40 million people had watched a child break down on live television, and now they wanted to see what happened next. They wanted to know if Danny was okay. They wanted to know if the show would survive. They wanted to be part of a story that had accidentally become real. Ron watched the numbers come in from his office, Gerald Fontaine sitting across from him, with an expression caught somewhere between relief and grudging respect. "You got lucky," Gerald said. "Those numbers could have gone the other way. They could have buried us." Ron nodded slowly. "Maybe, but I wasn't thinking about numbers when I made that call. I was thinking about a 12-year-old kid who needed someone to see him as more than just a product." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "For what it's worth, Howard, I would have cut to commercial. I would have kept the cameras rolling, and I probably would have made that kid finish his scene." He looked back at Ron with something almost like admiration. "I'm glad you didn't ask for my opinion." The weeks that followed were difficult. Danny saw a therapist twice a week. His mother saw a lawyer. The show's producers saw an opportunity to turn tragedy into publicity, which Ron fought against. He didn't want Danny to become the kid who cracked on live TV. He wanted Danny to have a chance at a normal life. Remember the 3 questions I opened at the beginning of this story? Now watch how they close, one by one, in reverse order. The third question was about what Ron would do when faced with a choice between protecting his show and protecting his people. The answer: Ron chose his people. He chose a 12-year-old boy, over 40 million viewers, over a network executive's expectations, over his own career security. That changed the culture of that show in ways that are hard to measure. Crew members started speaking up when something felt wrong. Actors started trusting that their concerns would be heard. The second question was about Linda Weaver and what she'd been doing to her son. Linda wasn't evil. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd poured everything into her son's career because she believed that was how you showed love, by pushing, by demanding, by never accepting anything less than perfect. She'd been raised that way herself. The tragedy wasn't that she was cruel. The tragedy was that she genuinely thought she was helping. When Danny started therapy, his therapist suggested family sessions. Linda resisted at first, then eventually agreed. It took years, but slowly, painfully, she started to understand the difference between supporting a child's dreams and crushing them. The first question was what Danny's whisper actually meant. Danny Weaver did return to the show, not right away. He took 6 weeks off, which the writers covered with a storyline about his character visiting relatives out of state. When he came back, something had changed. He was calmer, steadier. He still hit his marks and delivered his lines, but there was a lightness to him now, like he'd finally been given permission to be a kid who happened to act instead of an actor who happened to be a kid. He finished out the final 2 seasons of the show, then stepped away from Hollywood entirely. Last anyone heard, he was teaching drama at a high school in Oregon, helping teenagers understand that there's more to performance than perfection. And Ron Howard? He kept directing, he kept producing, he kept showing up on sets and in control rooms, doing the work he'd been doing since he was a child himself. But something had changed for him too, After that night, he started paying closer attention to young actors on his sets. He started asking questions that went beyond blocking and line delivery. He started creating spaces where kids could be kids, even in the middle of a professional production, not because it was good for ratings, not because it made him look like a hero, just because it was right. Here's the final question I want to leave you with. What would you have done in that control room when you had 11 seconds of dead air and 40 million people watching, and a child who just told the world he didn't want to be there anymore? What call would you have made? It's easy to say you'd choose the kid. It's easy to say you'd kill the feed and walk onto that stage and kneel down and ask if he was okay. But in the moment, with the pressure and the lights and the voices in your headset demanding you keep the show moving, in that moment, the right choice isn't always the easy choice. Ron Howard made the hard choice that night. He made it quickly, without any hesitation, like he'd been waiting his whole career for exactly that moment. That's the story of Stage 4, on the night Danny Weaver stopped mid-line and whispered 5 simple words into a live camera. It's a story about what happens when someone in power decides being human matters more than being professional. If this meant something to you, tell me in the comments below. And if you want to hear what happened the night a phone call from the network almost ended everything he'd built, let me know. That story's been waiting to be told.